Hello everybody, and welcome to our first episode of Bunny Tales with Zeb. In case you didn't know, I'm Zebedee, but everybody calls me Zeb, and I'm a British bunny. I like tea, carrot cake, and most of all, listening to my favorite human read. I call her my mummy.
Thanks, Zeb. Today we're going to read Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter.
Yay!
The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a rabbit hole under a big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you can go into the fields or down the lane, but don't you go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. Mrs. McGregor put him in a pie. Now, run along and don't get into trouble. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought some bread. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail were good little bunnies. They went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter ran right away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuce and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Then he felt rather sick, and he went to look for some parsley. But there he met Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees. He was planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter. He waved a rake and called out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was terribly frightened, and he ran all over the garden because he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe among the potatoes. Then he ran on 4 legs and went faster. He might have got away if he had not run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the buttons of his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and cried, but some friendly sparrows heard him. They flew to him and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve. He wanted to pop it upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled just in time. He left his jacket behind him and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. The can was full of water. Mr. McGregor was sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps under a flower pot. He began to turn them over and looked under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down. He was out of breath and frightened, and he didn't know which way to go, and he was very wet because he had sat in the can. After a time, he began to wander about and looked all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep. She was carrying peas and beans to her family. Peter asked her for the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. He came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He went back towards the tool shed, and suddenly he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter jumped underneath the bushes, but as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and looked around. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor. His back was turned towards Peter, and behind him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could. Mr. McGregor was at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home. He was so tired that he fell down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and closed his eyes. His mother was cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea and gave him a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper.
Well, that was a hair-raising tale, but I have one question.
Yes, Zeb.
Are you going to put me in a pie?
No, never, Zeb.
Oh, phew. Tune in next week for Bunny Tales with Zeb.
TTFN.
Ta-ta for now.